Okay, check one, check two. Hello, we're going live here for our Thursday morning hangout. A few minutes behind today, sorry about that, everybody, if you were standing by. Today I want to do a deconstruction of kind of a motion test that I was putting together for a client. There's some Photoshop stuff, some After Effects stuff, and some Cinema 4D elements, and I want to try to quickly kind of give you the, not so much tips and tricks, but just the techniques that are being used to put this together. So maybe there's some techniques that you can put into your tool belt and use in the future. Actually, I'm just going to go full screen on this video here. And this is what we're going to be deconstructing a bit here. Let's see if the audio comes through. Then we kind of cut the audio out. So you can see what we're trying to put together here is, let me do a little picture-in-picture one moment here. No, it's not going to let me do that. So we're working on this film centering around fake news and disinformation, and they wanted all these grungy tests, whether it was like paint brushes or what we're doing in the background or kind of the pillar coming in and falling apart. So let's just talk about trying to deconstruct each part of this. And one moment, everybody, I'm really trying to get my picture-in-picture to work. It's not wanting to participate here. I guess that's not going to work today. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is some of this paintbrush stuff we got going on, and a little bit of what we got going on in the background in terms of animated textures. So let's actually go to Photoshop, and we're going to be using the Photoshop timeline to build some of these elements. I'm going to show you first one of the backgrounds I've got going here. Let me go ahead and move this up. And so here you can see I've got 6 layers. They're each on screen for roughly 4 frames, and then they cut, and I'll just hit play, and you can kind of see what I got going here. And that's basically it. So this is one element, and then if I come back into After Effects here, you can see, let's see, I think I put it on probably the second half of the test, where I swap the backgrounds out here. And you can see that background, it's just, because the lines are black and my background is gray, it's just very faint. But it just gives you that kind of oscillating texture in the background. So making it is incredibly simple. So I'm just going to open up a new, I'm not even going to do a full 1920 1080. I'm just going to do a big old 1500 by 1500 square. And go ahead and bring this down a little bit. So the first thing we need to do by default is to actually create a video timeline. You're not going to have one totally out of the box. And if you don't see the timeline, you can always go to Window and pull up your timeline. And so the first thing I'll do is actually delete this base layer because I want an alpha channel on all this. And I'm just going to come into my timeline here and take a look. And so first thing I'm going to do is take a look at the brushes that I'm going to use. And so I actually need to go into my brush presets. And I was using some acrylic brushes. If you're on the newest Photoshop, you're going to have all of Kyle Webster's brushes, which are absolutely fantastic. They used to be sold individually. And I'm just going to play around a little bit. Let me see what I can do kind of with a dry media brush. I want something with a little bit of grit in it, like that. And I actually think that doesn't look terrible. And just for the sake of the demo, I just need it to be black. So I'm actually going to go ahead and pull this in quite a bit. Keep it around actually, I'm going to come in here and actually use the cut tool to create my first 2 frames. So I'll come on the first one, and I'm just gonna have a little fun here. I'm just gonna use my mouse. You can kind of hear it. Don't want to fill it up too much. I think that looks okay. I'll go to the next frame. I'll select that one. Maybe I'll come at it maybe a little more circular motion, and like so. I'm actually going to cut it again. I'll pull this out, cut the layer again, come back in here with my eraser and start over on this third frame. I'll kind of come up from the bottom a little bit, just draw a little bit with my mouse. And so you can already see I'm starting to get the foundation of that going, right? I'm getting the base of it going. I could play with the timing as much as I need. I can go ahead and cut, and there's scripts and various tools that help you automate some of this timeline building, but since this is actually a pretty small number of frames, I don't mind just getting in here and kind of doing a little bit of straight ahead animation. And we'll say this is our last one. I'll come in from this corner. And I'm not going to go crazy. I'm actually going to keep that one pretty light because some of my other ones were a little dark. So this kind of becomes the foundation of a single element, right? A single animated oscillating texture of just totally random lines. And so at the beginning of this animation test, excuse me, I need to bring open a Finder window here. At the beginning of this animation test, I literally just sat down for about an hour and just tried to create a folder full of Photoshop files that would actually serve as elements that I can use. Let me make sure. All right, everybody's good. So you see I've got just kind of a gritty background, and then I actually have some thinner lines going in here. Here I was doing a little bit with a thicker brush, again, that kind of dry media look where you get this super rough edge. Let's see, some of those were duplicates. And then I actually, and the computer's being a little bit slow here, went ahead and did some paint builds. So let's actually go ahead and open one of these, and you can kind of see what I was doing here. I also wanted to build some elements that would act as kind of an alpha matte. This is something I've talked about quite a bit before, of just building your own reveal mattes or kind of an inverse alpha matte where it could take something away. And let me just open up a couple of the other ones. Let's see what we did here. So this one's a little just more of kind of a blob going in the center of the screen. And again, the technique is exactly the same, right? Except on this one, I'm not just actually oscillating all of the individual brushes. I'm actually building it up, right? So it starts with nothing, then a little bit, then a little more. And here I was using these actual acrylic brushes to just try to give me just moments like this where I'll get to see these kind of rough paint strokes in the middle. And so I just quickly build out some line wiggle stuff. Let's go ahead and bring in this gritty background. This one I was thinking more of as a background. So I actually went almost to a full second and just used a dry media brush and kind of decided, well, I'll try to paint in almost the entire frame, but I won't go all the way, right? Like I'll make sure, so if we go to this frame, the one thing I'll keep in mind is just trying to keep little details like this, right? Like this kind of white area, this kind of white area, and just making sure it's not exactly the same on each frame, right? So then I get to this one, I'll leave a little bit of transparency in this corner, a little bit of transparency right here. And so it just gives you that rough, gritty feel. And the other reason I like this is that it's not, it is a stock element, you could say, but it's your own custom stock element. So I guarantee if you sat down with your Photoshop and your mouse and you tried to even replicate this exactly, it would just be ever so slightly different, right? Because since we're just kind of hand painting it and doing it quick, you really can't come up with the same result twice, which is something I really like about kind of building a little basket of elements like this. And so that just leads us right into Photoshop. And we should say that, you know, so let's go to Paint Build 5. When you import the Photoshop file, the one thing you need to make sure of, and let me just go ahead and run an import so we can talk about it really quickly. I'm just going to go to my desktop, go to my Paint Builds. So let's say Paint Build 05. So by default, it is saying import as footage. Now, we don't want to do that, right? We want to actually say composition, retain layer sizes. And we also need to make sure that because I have a bunch of PSD files right here, and they actually are named sequentially, that Photoshop sequence is not checked. Sometimes this will be automatically checked. Really want to make sure that is not checked. So we can just bring in this Photoshop file as a composition, retaining its layer sizes. And here it kind of asks you the same thing again. Comp, retain layer sizes, good, good, good. And then that's going to actually bring in our data here in the exact same way we had it in the Photoshop timeline, right? Your timing is going to come over. So, you know, if I go to my grit here, and I actually ended up duplicating this way, way out in the comp, but you can see the base frames were these, you know, 7 or 8 frames here. So this is a really useful workflow, right? Being able to paint directly in Photoshop and then get directly into After Effects. So you can see in deconstructing this scene, I've got my grit wiggle as kind of the first thing, just sitting in the background here. If I actually pull this out a bit. So this becomes my foundation, where I've just got this looping texture. Then I've got a little kind of rig here, which is basically just 2 solids and a null object. And I'm actually controlling these 2 solids here with this null object. So you see I've got some scale, some rotation. I've got a position keyframe, but there's actually no need for that. So you can see what I'm doing here is actually, and I know that the purpose of my shot is to kind of start in this wide shot, where we're going to start on these first words. I'm going to do the whole 3D thing. It rotates, and then it turns into a pillar which begins to crumble. So that's kind of the thought that's going on in the shot. So first I just needed this kind of red and blue split, where I'm doing it, and then I kind of rotate. Now the kind of interesting thing that I had to figure out here was actually when I rotate my column, I actually then kind of freeze frame it, and then I froze the actual column into a PNG, right? I rendered out just a single frame of the column once it reaches its resting place, which is right about here. And if you can see in my comp where I actually split between a composition with that column, and then I go ahead and switch to a PNG that I then just masked and animated by hand. So you can see how then I just animated each of these pieces individually. So I could do the timing exactly as I needed. I could have them bounce and land exactly where I need them to land. But let's actually go back to the beginning here, where we're trying to bring this text onto the screen, right? And the text isn't really animated or anything, it's just kind of hovering there. So let's see. And I'm just going to go ahead and open a new comp just to make this easy to understand. So let's go ahead and bring in Paint Build 5. So that should work, right? Does its little number there. Let's go ahead and rotate it into the center of the screen. Okay, no comments. If you're having any trouble hearing or seeing any of this, please let me know. So we see our paint build, it's going to do its little thing, so I've got that element going. That's going to be my background. I'm actually going to go ahead and add a color overlay to this element, so let's just to make it a little clearer. Then I'm going to bring in another paint build 5, actually bring it the other way. Then I'm going to go ahead and bring in my text element, and we'll say truth. We're talking about truth. We'll blow this up ever so slightly, bring it into the middle here. And basically what we want to do is have our text use this paint build as an alpha matte, so that, and then we can offset this in time ever so slightly. So this is the moment I'm kind of looking for, right? Is this how it's going to build on little by little, right? That's the transition I'm looking for. And so if I go ahead and move, and the alpha matte is going to hide that layer by default, but we can turn it on if I need to reposition it. So let's actually make it a little smaller so that it takes a little bit longer to build that on. So basically what I'm doing in that first comp is kind of, you know, I've got my background paint that goes in, and then the word comes on. So that is working nicely there. And actually in this first shot, I was kind of, first I did the word truth comes on in white, and it's got a black background. Then I just went ahead and duplicated that entire thing and inverted the color. So then a white one kind of wipes through, but then black letters go on. So in the course of about a second, I've basically doubled that animation. I've basically done this twice over so that I could just try to make it a little more interesting. Right, I'm trying to keep everything really kind of fast moving. The audio in the temp track is moving along pretty nicely, so I don't want things to be too static. I'm actually going to launch Cinema 4D in the background here while we're talking about this stuff. Okay, so we go through this portion here. You see how we're doing the rotation. Then we come to this moment where, you know, per the client, we're trying to do things that deal with decay or crumbling or tearing or fading out. So that's why we're using the paint, we're using the grit. And then we get to this moment where we did a little test in Cinema 4D. And if I go ahead and open this comp and hit play here on the actual source file, it's pretty obvious what I'm doing here on the tear. And it actually doesn't end up getting used. Excuse me, we need to be looking at it here. You can see what we're doing with this tear here, which is doing a bit of soft body dynamics in Cinema 4D, which we'll quickly run through that setup. Now this didn't actually end up making the cut. We're not going to be doing any of this, but since I had to work on it here, so let's see, the tearing circle comp. This might have been one of my previous tests that did not. Oh yeah, this was the one. Oh, excuse me. So this is actually a really simple setup, and you know, go ahead and observe basically what we're doing here, right? Like a sphere, which acts as a soft body collider, or the cloth collider tag, and then an actual another sphere that's slightly larger that has a cloth tag, but then it has to go in a cloth nerd and a hyper nerd. But then we'll go ahead and talk about some of the settings inside this cloth tag. So let's go ahead and make a new file altogether. We'll bring in a first sphere. And if you're not aware, we've got this area here called tags. And then under simulation tags, we've got rigid body, soft body. And I'm running an older version of Cinema 4D, but I assume even the absolute newest one is going to look pretty similar. So I'm going to add a cloth collider, because this is what I want to actually serve as the basis of, you know, actually tearing the geometry. So then we need to go ahead and duplicate it, remove the cloth collider tag. I'm going to scale it up just a skosh. And then for this tag, I'm going to add the actual cloth tag. Now inside the cloth tag, we need to go ahead and look at some of our forces here, some of what's going on. And we need to make sure that we check use tear. And so if I hit play, nothing's going to happen just yet. So one thing I need to do before I can move forward is actually convert these, and we talked a little bit about this last week, from a parametric object to actual geometry. So you need to hit C when that's selected. And so there we see now it's responding to the dynamics tags that we've placed on it, right? Let's go ahead and see our shading lines. Now, the only force that we have assigned to this scene is gravity. So that's why you see it just falling straight down. And I don't actually need or want any gravity. I need to go into forces. So I actually don't need any gravity. What I really need is wind direction, right? Because in my shot, I need it to tear away and kind of go. The thought, at least when I was doing the test, was kind of up and to the right, right? I thought it was maybe too boring just to go right to left. So maybe if like it tears and flies up towards that right corner, that would be the look that we would want to try here on this test. So we actually need to go into the cloth tag and do a little bit of wind direction. Let's go ahead and do X times 7. And this is definitely Definitely an issue of just playing with it. Now, you can do wind direction, but nothing happens until I enter some wind strength. So there you see I entered wind strength 5, and now it's totally freaking out. Let's take that down to 2. Let's go to 3. Now, the reason I'm not getting a really good-looking tear and it's behaving this way is because I need a cloth NURBS in here, right? So let's go ahead and add this guy to a cloth NURBS. And not quite strong enough. So we're going to have to play with those settings a bit. The other thing we can do is put the cloth NURB in a hyper NURB. So now we really, really subdivide that geometry, and we can try to get a fine tear going. So you see we're getting a little bit of tear up on one side. But now it's really just a matter of dialing in the forces on this cloth tag. So let's go ahead and say, if I take wind strength to 4, so now we're starting to get a little bit of a tear there. And it's not looking exactly like our other one. And so I'm only going in X, so now I want to go Y a little bit. So let's go to the right and up. So now you see it's starting to pull that direction. Okay. Still not quite good enough. So now let's check out some of our wind turbulence, so that the wind has a lot of turbulence in it, and now it's just totally, let's take that back down to 1, or let's take wind strength to 3, wind turbulence to something like 1.2. And then we're gonna start to get various tears as we do this. The other thing we could do is zero out Z strength, or even add a negative value to Z so that it actually comes towards the camera. So you see now it's actually kind of pushing the wind towards us a little bit. And so in doing the test, I mean, I must have sat here for a half hour kind of playing with these various settings. Global drag, so that's actually creating a bit of drag. We don't want any drag. We want it to just fly right off. Wind turbulence, wind strength tag. Then we could also come in here and look at some of these settings as well. So when you play with the tear, it's actually a little interesting, right? If you take the tear to 0, it doesn't tear at all. Take it to 100%, it's not tearing. For whatever reason, keeping it around 120, let's take it to 130%. And now it's even less hesitant. For whatever reason, 120% like really dials in it wanting to tear and rip apart there. So another way that you can go about changing the nature of these tears is actually in the beginning when you start. So let's say we had to start again. We're like, we're not getting what we want. One big thing you could do is change the way that the geometry is subdivided on your object. So if you bring in a sphere, it's going to have a standard subdivision, which creates basically this grid, right? Like you got all these edge loops, and everything is broken into squares. But if we were to take it to an icosahedron, it breaks everything into triangles, right? So you're definitely going to get a different tear if your geometry is subdivided in this different way. And I feel quite certain that on mine, I actually had this as an icosahedron, just to have smaller, more triangular subdivisions there. Thank you, Mike. Smooth broadcast so far. Good, good. Okay, so we do that portion. The thing that I really focused on then was just trying to find a texturing solution to this that would allow me to basically just use it as a matte. I didn't, in the final After Effects shot, I didn't necessarily, I just wanted it to feel almost like a 2D element, right? Like it doesn't really look 3D because I have a luminance texture on there. And I'll add a little bit of color. And I need to bring my luminance down a little bit. So let's play with a little bit of shading options here. So basically I'm going to turn on luminance. I'm going to turn on color. I'll turn color to mostly white. And you can see it's basically telling me it's going to be mostly white, but you may see the occasional shadow. So let's go ahead and put that. We can go ahead and throw that on the top of our hierarchy there on the hyper NURB. So we're going to get sort of this thing here where you'll see some of these dents, right? You'll see a little bit of that, but not a ton. For the most part, it's just going to look white. You know, it's just showing the geometry because I have it selected there. So the other thing I needed to do was, and let's actually go ahead and solo this tear. The other thing I need to do is make sure that when I render, I don't see this. So one thing we could try, I believe it's what I did, is go ahead and throw a compositing tag onto this sphere. And then in the compositing tag, let's say seen by camera. So I actually don't see it, right? So now it's an invisible object, but the dynamics are still respected, right? I can still collide things off of it, but when I go to actually render the sequence, I'm not going to see it. It's going to be invisible, and I'm just going to see my other sphere and the cloth. So the compositing tag is a great way that if you need something in your scene, but you don't actually want it in the final render, that you can go ahead and use a compositing tag and throw it on there. So that is essentially what I did. So if you actually see, this is the raw render out of Cinema 4D, is it just looks like kind of nothing is in there, right? It just looks like a black void. All right, let's see. So the next thing we'll take a look at here, let's go back to our main comps. You can see everything's really simple so far, right? Like I've made some paint stuff in Photoshop. I've got some gritty backgrounds that I've made in Photoshop. I'm using simple shape layers and a null to do this kind of red-blue thing. Now I've got this Cinema 4D sequence render that I can drop in there. We're doing a little bit with some kind of revealed masks here, where I'm just simply using a radial wipe on a layer that is circular because of a mask. And then I'm bringing in that next word there. Let's see. So one thing I wanted to play with was, okay, you know, we kind of get to the halfway point of this shot. We're saying, here's truth. Then I just simply created, let's go ahead and see those animate on. So just this part of the animation. So we don't need to go all the way to the end. But I just wanted you to see that element right there. So I'm using it as kind of a background, animates out, and then goes all the way in. So again, another really simple element in there that's helping me move this shot along, right? Like I wanted to take that gray all the way to the edge, decay animates away, and then while that rotation is happening on my pillar, and that's trying to start to take shape, then I'm going to bring that gray mask of the circle all the way in and just go ahead and get rid of it, right? Just cut the layer right after it gets to its smallest point. And then as that's happening, so one thing for me is just always trying to get really, really smooth motion. And that, for me, that typically looks like a lot of simple stuff that's just kind of stacking up and sort of coinciding, right? So like as this is coming down, that rotates, and then this pillar is going to start to take shape. And that's where I start to bring in some of this line art. Let me make sure I've got all my line art layers. Where is that? So then you're going to start to see this white line art come in, where these pillars start to animate in. I've got this, and I'm just simply using a stroked path on those, a trim path, and that's probably actually too simple to cover. I think everybody is well aware of the trim path feature on shape layers. And then again, I'm coming back to that number 5 paintbrush build to go ahead and throw an element right in the middle of the screen as the pillar starts to crumble. And again, the pillar was definitely the interesting part of the shot, where really you can focus on how I've basically got live layers, but then it reaches this point where then I just actually rendered out a PNG of the pillar, and then I duplicated the pillar over and over until I had it broken into all these little pieces. And that was just as simple as, duplicating the pillar PNG. So if I actually turn this mask off, you can see this is the element I'm playing with, right? Like it takes up the entire screen. The comp does anyway because I rendered it as a PNG. And then I'll just say add on this mask. So then I just have that piece, and then I'm animating directly on these layers. So let's go ahead and take a look at this animation. And it's not great. I probably spent 20 or 30 minutes putting it together, as this was just kind of an early test on this project. I'll go ahead and kill that audio for now. But you can see what I'm doing, right? Like it's position and rotation, and it's not super complicated. And some of my bounces are a little bit rough. But I basically had the thought of like, okay, this needs to feel like a concrete pillar, right? So like it shouldn't bounce too much. It's going to bounce a little because I want it to be a little playful. But really more than anything, it needs to kind of thud down and then slide, right? That sliding motion. And then I wanted it to be distributed, and this was kind of in my mind where I wanted the shot to land, right? As maybe the whole pillar isn't going to fall apart, but just some pieces of it kind of fall off and do their thing there. So let's actually unsolo that. And then I actually I didn't really animate it, just on a single frame. I'm going to go ahead and highlight these two layers here. I just switched the background, right? So I'm on the grit, and then I'm on there. Let me turn off. And if you just turn off the transparency of the background, it's just going to run this gray color on top of black. And I actually do have a dark gray solid, so let's go ahead and add that in, which is just slightly lighter, at least in terms of the wiggle on the lines there. So for me, doing these types of kind of custom backgrounds, I think is just a really great way to add something unique to your project, especially if it's in this vein where you do need to do gritty type of stuff, and it needs to have that decay or rough, or maybe even playful feel. I think the lines maybe feel kind of playful, which I think is cool. So let's see, there's really not much else going on in this test. And then we just kind of end. So this is a really good way to start a project. More and more for my client stuff, I'm definitely, we've got to do storyboards and we've got to do pitch decks and like do still frames. But a lot of times it's just as useful for me right now to take 4 hours and put together a test like this, right? If you've already gone through some of that early discovery and you've got an idea about the subject matter and you've got a sense of maybe a little bit of the visuals that they're looking for, is to just open Photoshop, open Cinema 4D. If you have a clear idea that you just want to see executed and maybe see what could be improved upon, or then you've got something to play with, that it's a really good way to kick off a project in those early stages. So this was a really useful test. There's some stuff in here that's going to make it into what the piece eventually becomes, but there's also some other stuff that's not going to make it, right, that they didn't like, which is helpful and useful to know. So Mike says, when you decided to use Cinema 4D for the tear, was that because C4D is the only program that can, or because it's better for that type of movement? Yeah, for me, Mike, I just didn't know how else to achieve a detailed cloth tearing. I feel like Cinema 4D is a really good option to do a cloth tear. So I think Cinema 4D is a great tool for that job. I'm sure there's other ways you could go about it. I think something that's definitely true is there are so many ways any visual idea could probably be executed. I think that's why it's important, especially if you're somewhat new to motion graphics, is doing a lot of projects in a lot of different software just to learn the tool sets, so that then when you have a client come to you and you think maybe a tear is relevant to this subject matter, maybe that's a visual that can make it in, then you've just got that in the back of your mind of like, I know how to put that together and I can do it pretty quickly and it's not too tough. So I'll be the first to admit there's always multiple ways to achieve a visual or a movement or an animation concept. But in this instance, I think Cinema 4D was definitely the right tool for the job. So that's what I wanted to cover today. If there's any other questions, let's get that in now. What are we? We're in week 9 now of MoGraph Mentor. I know you're doing a lot of critique and discussion in the classes, so I've been trying to use these Thursday mornings to just add little tips and tricks to your tool belt, because that's a really big part of it too, right? Is you've got to go deep on the design principles. It's what we just talked about with Sakani on our stream Tuesday night, of really learning your design principles, learning composition, doing lots of work. But then there is this technical side where it's good to know all these little technical processes that you can use to create your work. So I hope that there's some things in here you can add to your tool belt, keep in the back of your mind for projects in the future. So I think we're good on questions. As always, this entire demo is going to live up on the YouTube channel after this is over. Any questions, hit me up, DM on Slack. And if not, everybody enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see everybody soon.